In the summer of 1864, a man was on a train in the Deep South when it began to slow. When it came to a stop, the man hopped out and joined a long line of others just like him outside of a massive wooden fence. As the line of men approached the fence, its massive gate began to open, and when the man could see inside, he could barely believe the hell on earth in front of him. This is the horrifying story of the men behind those walls, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. During the summer of 1864, a train began to slow as it traveled through the Deep South. It had been a long journey from Virginia and was finally coming to an end for a man named Prescott Tracy. In happier times, this type of trek would likely end in a reunion with loved ones, but that's not at all what awaited him as the train came to a complete stop. As a private in the Union Army, or for the non-American viewers, you may know this as the North, Prescott was now deep behind the lines of the Confederacy, or the South, during the American Civil War. As he would soon find out, this would be the last place a person would want to be. His blue wool uniform was stifling as he emerged from the stuffy boxcar he had been kept in for 6 long days of travel. During that time, his treatment was less than humane. Water was difficult to come by and food was even scarcer. About 4 crackers a day and some meat on occasion were all he had been given during the trip. After hopping into the train car, Prescott joined a long line of others just like him outside a massive wooden fence, 15 feet or 4.5 meters high, made of Georgia pines that seemed to run in every direction. As he was marched closer and closer to the fence, a section of it swung open, and as soon as he could see inside, he could barely believe his eyes. It was a sight tens of thousands had already taken in, and by this point, it could only be described as hell on earth. Stepping inside the confines of the fence, Prescott had just become an inmate at the notorious Andersonville Civil War prison. Located 125 miles south of Atlanta, Andersonville today is a town of about 240 residents. And passing through it in modern times, it's difficult to imagine that it was once a place where tens of thousands were being held against their will. It's tucked deep in the south, not terribly far from the Georgia border with the panhandle of Florida. And with how tiny it is, Andersonville was just as much an unlikely place for a prison camp as it was a perfect place for one. For a bit of context, several years earlier, as with any war, prisoners of war who were captured needed to be held somewhere. General John Winder of the Confederacy was then placed in charge of the military prison system around Richmond, Virginia. Quickly after the establishment of some prisons in that area, however, problems began to make themselves known, the most pressing of which was overcrowding. In the earlier stages of the Civil War, the North and South had what amounted to a prisoner exchange program. This allowed captured soldiers to go home on the promise that they wouldn't rejoin the battle ranks. This meant that neither side had to care for and feed thousands of enemy soldiers while the war raged on. That program, however, eventually came to an end for a variety of reasons, and afterward, each side needed to account for the men they captured during battles, and prisoners came into prisons faster than they could be built or expanded. The other problem that those first Richmond-era prisons presented was that they were too close to the border with the Union. For the Confederacy, if the North ever successfully invaded and liberated any of those prisons, it could bolster their numbers. So General John Winder then asked his son William to go on a scouting mission. William was charged with finding a place to establish the Confederacy's next prison camp, one intended to be, quote, a grand receptacle in John's words for captured enemy soldiers. This mission came with only 2 requirements in mind. The first was that it had to be far away from Richmond, and second, it had to have easy and close access to a major railway line. When William arrived in Andersonville, Georgia, he didn't have to look any further. The site he chose was just a few thousand feet away from the Andersonville train depot and also had access to the Flint River, which ran just a few miles away. Construction on the Andersonville prison, which was officially named Camp Sumter, then began in early 1864. It initially covered about 16.5 acres of land, shaped in a parallelogram, and it was surrounded by an infamous wooden stockade fence. Inside the fence were 2 hilly areas split almost right down the middle by a creek and a swamp, both filled with equally muddy water. And despite the area being surrounded by forest, the area inside the camp was completely devoid of shade or cover of any kind. This, however, was just the beginning of its poor conditions. The Confederates didn't wait long before they started ushering prisoners toward Andersonville. In fact, the prison was considered open for business, so to speak, during the same month construction began. About 500 prisoners were part of the first wave brought in, as parts of the fence meant to keep them in were still being built. When it was first constructed as well, it was initially designed to house around 10,000 prisoners total, but very quickly after it opened in the late winter of the same year, it started welcoming in about 400 to 500 prisoners daily. But even despite the rapidly rising numbers, getting the prison into working order was barely a concern for the Confederacy because they were struggling to simply house the number of captured soldiers. As a result, right from the beginning, food was incredibly scarce, and that would never change. By April 1st, Andersonville was home to 7,100 prisoners, and just a month later, the figure almost doubled and showed no signs of stopping. By June, more than 26,000 prisoners were occupying a space meant for less than half that figure. This forced the Confederacy to expand the prison's footprint to about 26.5 acres. That made things a little less cozy for a short period of time, but the prison's population kept growing and growing. By the time Prescott arrived in June, there were already 28,000 prisoners being held there, and it would add another 5,000 by its peak 2 months later. To put this into perspective, if Andersonville was counted as a city, its prisoner population would have put its 26 measly acres as the 5th largest in the Confederacy at the time. Just as it was a problem in Richmond, Camp Sumter rapidly became impossibly overcrowded, and this led to conditions that would help the prison earn its notorious reputation. The horrific nature of what Andersonville became as a result is tough to put into words, but it helps if we look at it in terms of the basic human needs: food, water, and shelter. Since it's the simplest to convey, let's start with shelter, because simply put, there was none. Prisoners weren't given tents, there were no huts or barracks built, and there was barely any scrap wood available to cobble together any kind of cover. So in order to shield themselves from the outdoor elements, men would often strip naked and stretch their clothing to create makeshift shelters. This unfortunately still did very little to protect them. Prisoners also used anything they could find to construct what became known as shebangs, which is a term that covered a wide array of lean-to and tent-style housing. Consider too the fact that in this part of Georgia, temperatures can hover around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26.6 Celsius even on the coolest nights. During the day, those figures could soar in excess of the high 90s Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius and hotter. In those temperatures, the sun would beat down on the men, and the high humidity in the region made things even more uncomfortable. Prisoners were also not given any kind of clothing upon arrival either. Instead, they wore what they came in with, and after a long enough time, well-made Union uniforms would degrade enough to barely cover much of their bodies at all. And that's if they weren't using their clothing for shelter in the first place. And the heat and exposure were only made all the worse by the horrid smell of the prison, which was unbearable at best, even before it was filled with 33,000 captured Union soldiers and officers. The entire camp was eventually covered in human waste, and that included both the Black Swamp and stream, which was the prisoners' only source of washing, cooking, and drinking water. The stream was only about 6 feet or 2 meters wide, and at its deepest, it would only reach your ankles. And in addition to human waste, it was also filled with stumps, general garbage from the camp, and scraps of rotting food left to fester from the cookhouse. Its water was described as dark and extremely silty, so the men would do their best to try to filter it through their shirts or any other piece of cloth they could get their hands on. As a result of all of this, disease ran rampant, with men dying by the dozen from waterborne illnesses like typhoid fever or gastrointestinal disorders like dysentery. Conditions were so bad that it took just minutes to become infected, as one Confederate dignitary would find out. The Surgeon General of the Confederacy was sent to Camp Sumter to inspect conditions and was absolutely horrified by what he saw. During his 1-hour tour, he vomited twice from what his senses were picking up and contracted a bad case of the flu, which manifested by the time he returned to Richmond to report his findings. And as you can imagine, all of this led to an ever-rising death toll. In fact, at one point, the prison was averaging 96 deaths per day, many of which could be attributed to illness stemming from the condition of the prisoner's water supply. And as mentioned as well, food was a problem right from the start at Andersonville. In fact, it was a problem throughout the entire Confederacy, and if the South was struggling to feed its own citizens and soldiers, there was even less to go around for the prisoners. Each day, prisoners were given rations of mostly cornmeal. If they were lucky, there was a bit of meat to serve, but that was usually either rancid upon arrival or included the less savory parts of the animal, like organs and intestines. About twice a week, the men were also given 2 tablespoons of rice in place of pork and 2 tablespoons of molasses about twice a month as a treat. And while these measurements may sound precise, the distribution of food was often unequal, and some men wouldn't get rations at all. Even worse, inside the prison walls, the Confederates had built a cookhouse upstream from the swamp, and its cooks would regularly toss discarded and rotting meat parts into the water, further contaminating the supply. As more and more captured soldiers and officers poured into Andersonville by the hundreds, rations were reduced that much more, leading to severe emaciation and starvation. This led to a horrendous sight for new prisoners arriving at Camp Sumter when the gates swung open to welcome them in. Robert H. Kellogg, a sergeant major in the Connecticut Volunteers, wrote in his diary that they were greeted by, quote, walking skeletons covered in filth and vermin upon his arrival at Andersonville. It was such a dire scene that he wrote that only God himself could save them from such an indescribable place. And to accurately convey just how horrific this sight was, we actually have photographs of some of these poor men. This was right around the time photographs began to be used, and what they captured at Andersonville is haunting. To be very clear, these are living men, and we've blurred the majority of their bodies to meet guidelines, but from their faces and their limbs, you can tell that the description of walking skeleton is perfectly and tragically accurate. It's hard to fathom how someone could even survive being in this state, and many simply didn't. Between exposure, dehydration, waterborne illness, general disease, and starvation, we have more than enough to establish Andersonville as the deadliest prison in Civil War history. But incredibly, even that wasn't all the prisoners had to concern themselves with. The fence that kept prisoners inside, for example, wasn't actually the boundary for the men being kept there. From the fence to an imaginary border about 19 feet inside the camp was an area known as the deadline. Prisoners were instructed in no uncertain terms that they were not to cross the deadline, which only further served to reduce the amount of space each prisoner had to himself. And if they happened to cross that line, it meant certain death for any prisoner, no matter the reason. Confederate guards sat in what were called pigeon roosts, high above the prison population, and were ordered to fire on any prisoner who so much as stepped a toe onto the deadline. In his diary, Prescott tells of a man he identifies as only Roberts, who was washing his face near the deadline when he slipped and fell with his head just outside the border. The other prisoners then shouted to him, but it was too late. The Confederate sentries already had him in their sights and shot him the moment his head hit the clay. And if the conditions imposed on them weren't enough, as so often happens in prisons, gangs started to form, and the prisoners, again, all of which were from the same army, were suddenly forced to choose sides. A group of about 200 men calling themselves the Andersonville Raiders formed in hopes of giving themselves a better life inside the camp. They would go on to steal jewelry, money, food, and clothing from the others as they armed themselves with clubs and killed to get what they wanted. Despite their small numbers, the Raiders terrorized the prison, making life that much worse for the average prisoner. In response to this, soon enough, another group came together to fight the brutal behavior of the Raiders, this one calling themselves the Regulators. The Regulators quickly beat back the efforts of the Raiders, but again, all this did was make life worse for those simply struggling to stay alive inside Andersonville. Once the Raiders were effectively defeated, the Regulators elected a judge and held trials for the men who made up the Raiders. They even selected a jury of brand new prisoners so that the ultimate conclusion of each trial would be determined by impartial men. Upon finding members of the Raiders guilty, punishments were decided. Those who were guilty of lesser offenses were made to do one of three things. First, they could be made to run a gauntlet, which was where they were forced to run back and forth between two rows of people and struck with sticks or whips as they passed. Second was wearing a heavy ball and chain, or finally, they were sent to the stocks, which were heavy wooden restraints meant to lock them in place. And the penalties were much stiffer for the 6 men who formed the Raiders and were known to be the ringleaders. Once they were found guilty, a gallows was quickly built for them in the middle of the camp. By July of 1864, things were so out of hand inside Camp Sumter that the officer who oversaw the prison, Captain Henry Wirz, took drastic measures. He paroled 5 prisoners to deliver a petition signed by the majority of Andersonville's prisoners, asking the Union to reinstate the prisoner exchange program to relieve overcrowding. Just a few months earlier, Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant put an end to the exchange because the Confederacy refused to release black prisoners of war. He believed that they should be subject to the same conditions of release as white soldiers, but since the Confederacy would not agree to this, Ulysses prohibited the exchange of Confederate prisoners for Union prisoners. That petition was then delivered, but it wasn't enough to sway the Union general, and the request was denied. This would lead to the Camp Sumter prison population swelling beyond 30,000 later that year. Late in the summer of 1864, things had gotten so bad that the Confederacy offered to conditionally release prisoners anyway if the Union would just send ships to retrieve them. Unfortunately, this didn't do much good for Andersonville though, since the town was located far inland and the prisoners would have to be transported by rail to a navigable waterway. So instead, when fall came around, any prisoners who were well enough to be moved were temporarily sent to 2 separate camps, one in Florence, South Carolina, and another to Millen, Georgia. Both of these prisons were much less crowded and offered prisoners far better conditions. However, as the North pushed the Confederate front lines back, the Confederacy got word that they might get close enough to liberate the men there. This caused them to evacuate all those prisoners back to Andersonville. It's difficult to imagine the devastation that prisoners must have felt about this. Thankfully, salvation would seemingly come in April of 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses and the Union Army at Appomattox, Virginia, signaling the end of the brutal and costly American Civil War. It wasn't until May, however, that Camp Sumter was finally liberated. Afterward, Union troops responsible for taking control of the prison were horrified by the conditions they saw. One, in fact, would describe what he witnessed as, quote, human skeletons amid hellish scenes of desolation. All of the weak and emaciated prisoners then need to be transported back to their homes in the north, and many of them were sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi to catch a steamboat up the Mississippi River to Illinois. For those liberated prisoners, the feeling of their time at Andersonville coming to an end must have been overwhelming despite their fragile states, but the tragedy wasn't over just yet. Almost 2,000 former Andersonville prisoners were crammed into every corner of a steamboat called the Sultana, which had a maximum capacity of just 376 people. Before picking up the prisoners, the ship suffered a boiler malfunction which required a pretty extensive fix, but the boat captain ordered that a quick repair be done so he could transport the prisoners home. There wasn't a noble reason for this, however. If the ship needed to be docked for several days for repairs, he'd miss out on the very lucrative opportunity as the Union officers were offering big money per head. This, however, would end up being a huge mistake. 2 days after the ship got underway with its heavy load of passengers, the already strained boilers exploded, tossing bodies in every direction into the icy cold Mississippi River. Many of those who survived the initial blast were then killed when the Sultana's smokestacks collapsed, causing the top deck to also collapse onto the middle deck. Men aboard were sandwiched between the two decks, while others who were blown into the water were swept away by the churning river, which was experiencing one of the worst floods in recent history at the time. Official numbers have changed and varied over the years, but it's believed that at least 1,000 of the prisoners who survived Camp Sumter lived only long enough after it was liberated to die in the Sultana disaster. Sometime later after the war, Henry, the Confederate officer overseeing Camp Sumter, was tried by a military tribunal on charges of war crimes for the conditions he allowed there. Many of the former prisoners testified against him, telling the tribunal horrifying stories of abusive treatment and accusing the captain of specific acts of cruelty. Henry's defense argued that there was evidence of him pleading with the Confederate government for more food and various means that would improve conditions there that went unanswered. In the eyes of the tribunal, however, there was no defense for his negligence and the lack of care for the prisoners, and he was found guilty of war crimes. On November 10, 1865, he was one of 3 men ever executed for war crimes perpetrated during the Civil War. Today, the Andersonville prison still stands as a National Historic Site and museum, as well as a national cemetery for the Union prisoners who died and were buried in mass graves there. It's believed that more than 45,000 Union soldiers and officers came through the Andersonville prison during its operation, which lasted just about a year and a half. Of those, around 13,000, or about 29%, died there, making it one of the entire war's deadliest grounds, despite not even being a battlefield. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.